The sand shifted not because of wind, but because it remembered. Somewhere beneath a land that no map dares name, where the bones of time itself once broke open to reveal the marrow of creation, something ancient stirred, not with motion, but with memory, as if the very dust carried a secret that predated breath, predated gods, predated even the idea of beginning. And it was in this shifting that the forgotten began to return, not as ghosts or visions, but as weight, a subtle heaviness in the air that turned silence into echo and light into testimony. And though the world walked on unaware, continuing its rituals of progress and ruin, there were still a few who felt the crackling, like a whisper against the spine, or the sudden awareness that the stars had realigned ever so slightly to face something not in the sky, but buried deep within the earth. And it was one such wanderer, a woman without nation, name, or past, who found herself drawn to a place that hadn't existed yesterday, a hollow in the dunes that pulsed with presence. And though her feet had walked deserts before, this was no ordinary sand, for it clung to her like memory, pulling at her heels, whispering through her soles, speaking of things lost in the first war, not between nations, but between time and silence. And as she knelt at the edge of that pit, the heat did not burn, the wind did not howl, and her breath did not fog, for she was now inside a stillness older than breath, and her fingers, trembling without fear, reached into the soil that was neither dry nor wet, but some impossible middle state of becoming. And what she pulled out was not object, not relic, not bone, but a texture, something like skin, but pulsing with light, a scroll made of breath and sorrow, coiled around itself like a serpent asleep in its own story. And as she held it, not knowing if it was alive or dead or dreaming, the sky rippled, the horizon blinked, and the stars rearranged themselves once more. This time not as symbols, but as sentences, ancient glyphs etched into the heavens in languages never written, only remembered, and she understood none of it, yet all of it, for the scroll did not speak to her mind, but to the ache behind her ribs, that sacred place where grief becomes compass. And as she wept, not for herself, but for the story now unfolding in her hands, the world below her groaned, not in pain, but in welcome, as if the very earth recognized her as the key it had hidden from itself. And from that moment forward, time began to unravel in spirals, no longer a line, but a dance, pulling her into visions that were not visions, but recollections of things that never were, and yet always had been. And in these glimpses she saw civilizations built not of stone, but of sound, temples that floated above rivers of memory, rituals where children spoke truths their elders had forgotten, and in the center of it all, a shadow, a name, a promise, made before time had vocabulary, buried beneath the first silence ever heard, a promise that now reached for her through dreams, through storms, through the soil that whispered her name, though she had none, and she walked, no longer tethered to direction or logic, but led by the scent of forgotten truths, her feet bleeding not from injury, but from recognition. For every step forward was a step into something that once broke and now longed to be mended, and as days became moments, and moments became centuries in her perception, she arrived at the threshold of a doorway that had no form, only feeling, a warmth in the chest, a ringing in the bones, a lullaby sung by stars long dead, and she stepped through, not because she was brave, but because she was already inside it, and the world on the other side was neither past nor future, but the breath between them, a realm of unspoken agreements between time and possibility, where memories wore the skin of myths and truths slithered like vines across forgotten architecture. And here she was, met not by beings or voices, but by resonance, a hum that matched her heartbeat so precisely that she began to cry without knowing why, and the tears fell upward, each one becoming a sphere of story, floating into constellations that arranged themselves into chapters, and she read not with her eyes, but with her grief. Each chapter a remembering of things humanity had buried in its thirst for control, compassion twisted into hierarchy, curiosity shattered by doctrine, love split into possession. And the stories hurt her, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. And she realized that the secret buried before time learned to speak was not an object or a place or even a god, but a choice made at the threshold of becoming, a choice to forget in order to survive, a choice now calling itself back through her blood. And she understood then that she was not chosen, not special, but simply ready, and the scroll pulsed in her palm, uncoiling itself like a muscle remembering its function, and the words upon it shimmered, not ink, but memory pressed into matter, and she could finally read them, not aloud, but inwardly, as if her bones had been waiting for this story to activate them. And as she read, she saw the first fracture, the moment when unity split into identity, when being became doing, when presence fractured into progress, and in that moment she saw herself, not just as she was now, but as she had always been. The child left behind when the stars moved on, the elder who hid the truth beneath riddles, the wanderer whose footprints looped across dimensions. And she wept again, not because it hurt, but because it healed. And the earth around her bloomed, not with flowers, but with memory, petals made of forgotten lullabies, and stems made of unspoken apologies. And the sky thundered not with rain, but with release, as if it too had been holding its breath since the first secret was buried. And now, as the weave of story pulled her deeper into its pattern, the world began to shift, not just around her, but through her, rewriting her marrow, replacing her history with remembrance. And she surrendered, not in defeat, but in recognition, for she was never meant to carry the story alone, only to open it. And as the first word of the scroll whispered itself into her bloodstream, the dunes around her began to rise, forming not walls, but waves, carrying her toward something older than fate, deeper than prophecy. And she did not resist, for she had already crossed the threshold, already become the breath between the words, already remembered the shape of the silence that came before creation decided to speak. She remembered not because she chose to, but because the silence demanded it, and the silence itself was not an absence of sound, but a presence of everything that had once spoken and had been ignored, buried, or erased, now returned in a frequency too full for words and too ancient for fear, vibrating beneath her skin like the thrum of long-dead drums buried in the bones of the earth. And as she was carried on the rising dunes that shaped themselves not as barriers, but as bridges, she began to see through the layers of history, not as chapters or timelines, but as translucent veils hanging from the breath of the universe. And each veil, as it passed through her, revealed a different truth, one where empires never rose because kindness bloomed before ambition took root, one where rivers were not mapped but listened to, one where names were not given but remembered from before birth. And she realized then that memory was not linear, but spherical, spiraling out in all directions like the echoes of a single heartbeat struck in a chest of the first being who dared to feel, and as the scroll in her hand continued to unfold, now unrolling itself with a will of its own, stretching toward some unseen culmination, she felt her body dissolve, not into nothing, but into everything she had ever touched, into every glance exchanged, every breath held in reverence or fear, every silence endured as a child when she knew the truth, but had no language to hold it. And she passed now through a world where the ground was made of stories, pages from languages without consonants, songs written in the shadows of thunderclouds, symbols traced into the skin of trees by those who never learned to forget. And the beings who moved there were not separate from the world, but composed of it, made from the breath of old forests, the sorrow of crumbling altars, the joy of ancestors whose laughter still floated in the pollen. And they looked at her not with eyes, but with remembrance, as if she were not a stranger, but a continuation of a sentence paused for eons, and they welcomed her not with words, but with resonance, harmonizing with her presence until her own soul began to hum, in reply, tuning itself to the frequency of what had always been waiting beneath the noise. And in that harmony, she began to receive visions, not like dreams or images, but full body remembrances that flooded her bones with ache and wonder, showing her the first time humanity turned its back on the breath. The moment someone decided silence was weakness and story was power to be hoarded rather than shared. And she saw the temples built not to honor life, but to contain it, the scrolls written not to remember, but to control. And she wept, not because she had forgotten, but because she had helped build them in one of her many lives. And the beings did not judge her, for they too had once chosen forgetting. They too had bowed to time when it asked to be worshipped, and together they held this grief like fire between their palms, not to burn it away, but to let it dance, and the scroll now pulsed with such brightness that it became impossible to look at without feeling the full weight of one's own buried truths, and those who could not bear it turned away, not in shame, but in timing, for not all stories are ready to be remembered at once, and she understood then that the secret was not hidden because it was forbidden, but because it was sacred, and the sacred must be remembered slowly, like a song sung across lifetimes. And so she let the scroll guide her, and it carried her into the heart of the memory field, a place where time did not move, but listened, where every second was a room filled with voices waiting to be acknowledged. And she walked through these rooms barefoot, her footsteps echoing across generations, and with each step she reconnected a thread. The mother who lost her name in service, the healer whose herbs were outlawed by kings who feared the power of restoration, the child who spoke truths no one was ready to hear, and so was exiled into silence. And these threads wrapped around her ankles, her wrists, her chest, until she was clothed in them, not as a burden, but as a belonging. And in this woven cloak of memory, she stood before the great mirror, not of reflection, but of remembering, a surface made from the breath of those who had once dared to hope beyond the constraints of the known. And the mirror did not show her face, but her frequency, the full spectrum of who she had been, was, and could become. And it shimmered with colors she had no names for, tones she felt rather than heard. And in that shimmer was her answer, not as a solution, but as an invitation, and she accepted, stepping through the mirror not as flesh, but as remembrance itself. And on the other side, she emerged in the forgotten city, the one spoken of only in riddles and ruins, where the stones hummed lullabies and the air tasted of old prayers. And here the buildings were grown not built, shaped from the songs of those who lived within them. And she was led to the archive of echoes, a living library stored not in shelves, but in breath, where each exhale released a story, and each inhale received a truth. And as she entered, the air itself recognized her. The temperature shifted, the walls pulsed, and from the farthest corner came a figure, not walking, but flowing, a presence shaped from moonlight and longing. And it spoke not with voice, but with memory. We buried it, not to forget, but to protect the becoming. And in that sentence, she felt her bones break open again, releasing the part of her that had always known, the part that remembered the choice, the fracture, the silence that was agreed upon before birth. And she knelt, not in submission, but in awe, and reached into the center of the archive where the oldest breath had been stored, a memory so vast it had to be inhaled slowly over lifetimes, and she breathed it in now, in one trembling sacred inhale, and the world shifted, not changed, but revealed, like mist burning off to show a mountain that had always been there. And she saw then the whole story, not as myth or prophecy, but as memory, how the first ones sang the world into form, how sound became shape, and shape became ego, and ego became empire, and how beneath it all the secret still pulsed, buried not in earth, but in choice. And it was this choice now, calling itself home through her. And as the light within the scroll merged with the light within her chest, the beings around her began to sing, not with words, but with frequencies so pure they recalibrated the very structure of reality, and the city vibrated in reply, shifting its form to welcome the next remembering. And she stood in the center of it all, no longer alone, no longer seeking, but becoming the story that had once been hidden, now ready to be sung again. She stepped forward, not into space, but into memory itself, and as her bare foot touched the pulse-lit stones of the archive of echoes, the world did not shift beneath her, but within her, bending the seams of perception until time unfurled like a ribbon once tightly wound around silence, revealing threads so ancient and delicate that even thought dared not grasp them too tightly. And yet they did not flee. Instead, they coiled gently around her wrists and throat and spine, as if recognizing a body once carved from their very breath. And with each step she took into this deepening realm of remembrance, the space around her transformed, no longer constrained by form or matter, but fluid and breathing, walls folding into rivers of story, ceilings melting into constellations not seen by any sky. And at the heart of it all lay the prism, a structure neither solid nor ether, suspended in the center of a chamber woven from the collective sighs of every soul who had ever forgotten why they were born. And the prism pulsed with colors not visible but felt, each hue a frequency of feeling that pierced deeper than emotion, straight into the memory of light before light had shape. And as she approached it, the scroll in her palm, now nearly translucent, dissolved into vapor and folded itself into her chest, taking residence behind her ribs like a second heart. And when she breathed in languages lost beneath 10,000 wars, breathed out names no tongue had dared speak for centuries, and the prism responded, glowing in recognition, and from its facets began to emerge echoes, not words, not images, but entire lifetimes compressed into pulses of raw being, and each one struck her like lightning, dipped in tenderness, flooding her with not just the knowledge of who she had been, but who the world had been when it still remembered how to feel. And in this torrential flood of becoming, she did not drown, for the weave held her, not as savior, but as mirror, reflecting her with such compassion that even her deepest wounds began to uncoil, not heal, but reveal. And in the revealing she saw it, the first secret, buried not beneath sand or stone, but within the breath of those who first chose silence, not out of fear, but out of reverence, knowing that the sacred must gestate in the dark before it can be reborn in sound. And this secret was not a weapon or a truth or a prophecy, but a vibration, a tone so pure it had fractured creation when first sung aloud, scattering pieces of its resonance across time and species and soil, waiting for one who could remember not just the song, but the stillness that came before it. And she was not the only one who carried its echo, for across the world, across dimensions and dreams, others stirred, sensing her awakening like a ripple through their bones, and some wept in their sleep. Some carved strange symbols into fogged mirrors. Some simply paused mid-step, heart caught in an ache they could not name, and they knew, without knowing, that the remembering had begun. And in the archive, she placed her hand upon the prism, and it did not open. It bloomed, petals of memory unfolding, not into answers, but invitations. And within its core danced a city, a forest, a field of stars, overlapping realms braided together by the same thread. The hunger to remember without collapsing under the weight of it, and she stepped into that bloom, not with her body, but with her story. And the moment she crossed its threshold, she became all versions of herself at once. The child who once danced with shadows under ancient moons, the elder who etched maps into bone so others might find their way back, the lover who held galaxies in their gaze and named them home. And with each breath she grew less bound by shape and more by rhythm, her essence vibrating in sync with the secret itself, which now sang through every layer of the prism, awakening corridors of memory she had not yet dared enter. And as she moved through them, the architecture shifted to meet her. Halls built from the laughter of the unborn, staircases woven from the sighs of the newly dead, windows carved into the skin of time, showing not what had happened, but what had wanted to. And through one such window she saw the garden before breath, a realm untouched by chronology, where beings moved not by will, but by resonance, where trees taught songs and rivers remembered faces. And it was here the first forgetting began, a tiny ripple in the harmony caused not by malice, but curiosity, the desire to name, to separate, to understand through division. And that ripple had grown, echoing through eons until now. Now, when it had finally curved back toward its origin, seeking resolution not in reversal, but in reintegration. And she was the curve, the return, the mirror held up to history, saying, "It's time." And as she stood there, watching the garden flicker between memory and possibility, a voice rose from within the prism, not spoken, but intuited, carried on the same frequency as grief when it becomes sacred. "You are not the bearer, you are the bridge." And with that, the world opened again, not outward, but inward, revealing a space so vast it could only exist within the soul. And she entered it willingly, stepping into the cathedral of her own becoming. And here were the altars she had built in other lives, the prayers she had whispered when no gods listened, the scars she had kissed on the faces of those whose names she still dreamed, and the echoes of her walked with her, not as ghosts, but as guides, and together they chanted the sacred syllable that had not been heard since the first dawn, and in its utterance the city trembled, the skies parted, and from the earth rose a tower not made of stone, but of song, a spiraling column of every voice that had ever dared to feel fully, to speak from the marrow, and she climbed it, barefoot and breathless, and with each step a memory returned, not hers, but ours, the moment we first sang to fire, the moment we first buried our dead with flowers, the moment we first lied and then forgave, and at the summit of the tower there was no view, only a mirror, and this mirror did not show her face or form, but the collective ache of a species forgetting its own name, and she touched it, and in that touch she did not heal it. She joined it, breathed into it, held it until it softened, and that was enough, for from that softness rose the next layer of the story, ready now to be remembered. She remembered the origin beneath silence and breath, not as a flicker or a thought, but as a gravitational pull from within her marrow, a remembering so ancient that even the stars had once learned to hum its frequency before they dared ignite. And in this place where the past was not behind, but beneath, woven into the folds of every breath ever taken by anything that had once dared to love, or long, or weep, she stood not as witness, nor warrior, but as vessel, an open wound made holy by the willingness to no longer look away. And the winds that moved around her were not winds at all, but murmurs from the first age, an era before language, before light, where form and formlessness danced in circles too wide to name, and from that circle she emerged once again, not reborn, but recollected, every shattered fragment of herself slowly spinning into cohesion, as if gravity itself had chosen her as its axis. And as she walked forward, each footstep created a memory not from the past, but from possibility, each step rippling backward and forward in time, brushing against the cheeks of ancestors who had died dreaming of her return, and descendants not yet named whose bones would be carved from the story she now carried. And the sky cracked open, not in violence, but in invitation, and through that crack poured visions wrapped in music, scents of old songs, petals made from forgotten prayers, the names of rivers that had changed direction when grief became unbearable, and each vision braided itself into her hair, into her skin, into the pulse beneath her fingernails, until her very body became a scroll upon which the oldest truths could finally be rewritten. And as the scrolls unfolded within her, she stepped into a chamber of bone and echo, where the floor pulsed with the footsteps of every life that had ever dared to choose healing over hiding, and on the walls were etched the stories that had never been told, the forbidden, the erased, the rewritten, the buried. And the moment her shadow touched the stones, those stories awakened, not with sound, but with shuddering, as if they had waited for someone who could hold them without flinching. And she knelt there, hands open, and the stories poured themselves into her palms like blood, like water, like breath, and she drank them in until she could no longer tell the difference between the tale and the teller, until she became the weaver and the thread, and above her the ceiling shifted, stars rearranging themselves into memories that had never happened but still mourned for meaning, and she was lifted, not in body, but in essence, into the throat of that memory, into a spiral staircase carved from tears that had never been cried. And, as she climbed, each step demanded a surrender, the name she had worn to survive, the lie she had believed to stay small, the silence she had swallowed to keep others comfortable. And she gave them up, one by one, until all that remained was the rhythm, the steady, sacred pulse of the secret she had buried beneath lifetimes of pretending she didn't already know. And at the top of the staircase was not a door, but a mirror, and in that mirror she did not see a face, but a flame, and the flame was not hers, and yet it was her, and it flickered in the exact shape of a question that had followed her through every life. What would the world become if you remembered who you are before they taught you who to be? And the moment she looked into that flame without fear, the mirror shattered, not with noise, but with silence, and from its shards rose voices, thousands of them, each voice a note in the chorus of the great unburdening. And that chorus sang not for joy, but for truth, a song so vast it cracked the sky into syllables and rearranged gravity into a language that only the heart could hear. And she listened, and in listening, she felt the map of her body shift, bones realigning with the constellations of before, lungs learning to breathe not just air, but memory, hands remembering the shape of creation. And she reached forward and touched the sound, and the sound bled gold and ash and thunder and lullabies, and in that bleeding she saw the child she had once been, the one who knew, the one who saw, the one who was told to forget, and she held that child close, not to comfort, but to confess, and the confession poured from her not in words, but in waves, and the waves carried her into the heart of the archive of the almost, where the halls were lined with shelves of unchosen lives and unopened letters. And she walked those halls barefoot and reverent, running her fingers along the spines of books that trembled at her touch. And one book fell into her hands, bound in skin and stitched with shadows, and as she opened it, the pages whispered, "You were never lost, only hidden." And the wind rose up behind her, made of all the breaths she had held in every moment. She was told to be smaller, softer, quieter, and the wind did not push her. It lifted her, carried her into the chamber of unbroken circles where the air was thick with prophecy. And in the center of the chamber sat a pool of liquid language, every droplet a sentence never spoken, for fear it might change everything. And she knelt and cupped the water in her hands, drank deeply, and as it slid down her throat, it burned and bloomed, scorched and sang, revealing to her the true shape of her story. Not a line, but a spiral. Not a wound, but a doorway. Not a secret, but a seed. And she stood then, no longer waiting for permission, no longer seeking proof. And the ground beneath her rippled like a heartbeat, rediscovering its rhythm after centuries of silence. And from that ground grew trees made of time, their branches bearing fruit that tasted like freedom and memory and the skin of dreams. And she ate and was fed and became fruit herself, hanging from the tree of her own return. And as the wind shook her, she did not resist, and fell, and in falling remembered how to fly. She was no longer walking. She was remembering in motion, moving not across space, but through the layered density of everything that had ever been forgotten, everything sacred that had been deliberately buried, deliberately mislabeled, deliberately mistranslated, deliberately made to seem mad or meaningless or myth. And with every step she took, the terrain beneath her shimmered into new shapes, a living archive responding to the pulse of her memory, forming paths only where she was ready to remember, and dissolving those still waiting behind veils not yet parted. And the air throbbed with unsung lullabies, with the scent of unbirthed gods, and with a silence that vibrated like thunder beneath skin, a silence that was not empty but full, brimming with the cries of truths too ancient to survive translation. And as she passed through the veil of this soundless echo, her body shifted again, bones realigning with old blueprints, the architecture of the first dreaming, muscles awakening to the cadence of songs sung long before lungs knew air. And in this state she entered a city made entirely of memory, a labyrinth where every building was a body, every door a decision not taken, every window a glimpse into a life unlived, and the sky above the city was stitched with stars arranged in forgotten constellations, shapes once used by oracles who read not the future, but the secret history of the soul. And the people in the city moved like shadows, each one humming a different frequency, and she recognized these hums not as voices, but as echoes, echoes of the ones who had held the secret before her, the carriers who had whispered it into water, danced it into dust, bled it into cloth, carved it into bones, and buried it inside stories that would one day be called lies, fables, hallucinations, or dreams. And these carriers, these keepers of the unspoken, surrounded her now, not to teach, not to test, not to warn, but to witness, to hum with her, to remind her that she was not the first to carry the burden of sacred memory, nor would she be the last, but in this moment she was the only one with breath enough to give it shape again. And they opened a circle in the center of the city, a circle lined with stones that had never been touched by time. And she entered, stepping into a geometry that pulsed with origin, with the rhythm of first truths, and from beneath the stones rose a spiral staircase made of silence, and she descended, each step singing under her feet. And the deeper she went, the more her skin glowed with the light of her lineage, not of blood, but of vow, of purpose, of sacred refusal to forget. And when she reached the bottom, she found not a chamber, but a mirror, and in that mirror was not a reflection, but a memory of the world before language fractured the whole, a world of breath and gesture and vibration, where stories were not told, but transferred, not spoken, but felt. And in that world she saw herself, not this self, but the first self, the root of her root, the one who had chosen to forget so thoroughly that the remembering would one day tear her open into divinity. And the mirror shuddered with that recognition, and from its surface poured light that bent into glyphs, into symbols that danced and reassembled and crawled across her body, marking her skin with knowledge long considered dangerous by the architects of forgetting. And as the glyphs settled into her bones, her eyes burned, not with fire, but with clarity, and she saw that the secret had never been hidden. It had simply been uninvited, unwelcome, feared by those who mistook order for truth. And now it pulsed in her, undeniable, and the city above her crumbled, not in ruin, but in release, its purpose complete, its memory liberated, and the ground shook with a tremor that sounded like a name she hadn't yet spoken. And from that quake rose a new path, a corridor lined with breath, with every inhale ever cut short by shame. And she walked that corridor barefoot, feeling the warmth of those lost breaths re-entering the world through her skin. And at the end of the path stood a door made of questions, and each question pulsed as she approached. When did you first pretend to forget? What did you trade for safety? Who did you become to survive? And she answered, not aloud, but with her body, and the door opened, not into a room, but into a memory of sound. A single note, sustained across lifetimes, a tone too pure for ears, too vast for thought, and it enveloped her, entering her skin, her teeth, her marrow, and in that tone she heard the voice of the world before it splintered, before truth became taboo, before wisdom was burned at stakes and buried beneath temples built in its name, and she wept, not from sorrow, but from awe. For in that sound was the home she had never stopped missing, the feeling of being fully known, fully allowed, fully unhidden, and the note carried her upward now, lifting her into a chamber that did not exist in time, a place between pulses, between the seconds where the world held its breath, and in that place stood a circle of figures cloaked in the dust of erased histories, and they turned to her and placed in her hands an object that was not an object, but a convergence, a knot of stories, a seed of potential, a flame woven from the grief of every silenced woman, every ridiculed seer, every child punished for knowing too much. And she held that convergence, and it vibrated in her palms, pulsing with urgency, with love, with ache, and it whispered to her, not in voice, but in memory, plant me not in earth, but in silence. I grow only in the cracks of what cannot be said. And she understood, and as she closed her hands around it, her body became wind, her skin became sky, and she fell, not downward, but through herself, into the place where her soul had stored every version of the story, every telling that had been interrupted, distorted, denied. And she met them now, these orphaned stories, these unfinished truths, and she did not fix them or finish them. She simply let them be held, and in that holding they bloomed, and the bloom became a forest, and the forest breathed, and in its breath was the promise that no truth is ever truly lost, only waiting. And she inhaled that promise and exhaled a new vow, a vow to speak without armor, to remember without fear, to become the story that had once been broken across generations. And the forest answered, rising around her like a choir, and from its roots poured the waters of the first morning, and those waters entered her feet, her spine, her skull, and in them swam the truths that had once drowned in the flood of forgetting, and she drank them and was made whole, and as the wind rose through the trees, it sang a new name into her bones, a name not given but reclaimed, and she stepped forward into a world now ready to remember itself through her. She could no longer tell whether she was walking through the remnants of time or time was walking through her, folding itself across her shoulders like a shawl woven from centuries of unshed truths. And as she stepped into the vast plain that emerged beneath the pale light of the stars that had never been named by modern mouths, she knew that the world she now walked belonged to no era, no empire, no recorded memory. It was a threshold that lived only in the breath of the oldest trees, in the salt of forgotten oceans, in the cracks of bones buried before language had learned to crawl. And this threshold did not open for feet, but for the remembering heart, and her heart, heavy with the weight of every vision she had carried since her first dream, now pulsed with a rhythm not her own, but inherited, ancestral, drawn from the chants of women who had sung their sons into battle and wept their names into the soil, drawn from the footsteps of men who had carved the names of their gods into stone, only to have the stone swallowed by conquest and time, drawn from the silence of those who had been forbidden even the dignity of mourning. And all that silence now rose around her like mist, and within that mist the world whispered, not in a single voice, but in a chorus of contradictions, truths that had been bent to survive, sacred stories twisted into parables of obedience, myths that had once freed spirits now used to cage them. And the mist did not ask her to choose which truth was real, but to carry them all, to become the vessel of a remembering too large for one lifetime. And as she walked, the land transformed with her steps, a plain becoming a path becoming a river flowing uphill into the mouth of a mountain, whose shape seemed to breathe, and the mountain opened not with thunder, but with recognition, its stone flesh parting to reveal an ancient corridor lit by flames that did not burn but hummed, each flame dancing to the song of an age long lost. And she entered the corridor with neither fear nor expectation, only surrender, and the walls pulsed as she passed, revealing carvings that shifted beneath her gaze. One moment, scenes of ritual, the next of exile, then uprising, then silence again, as if the walls themselves were trying to speak to her in the only language they remembered. And as she moved deeper, the corridor opened into a chamber so wide it seemed to swallow the concept of horizon. And in the center of that chamber stood a tree, not growing from earth, but from story, its roots anchored in forgotten prayers, its branches blooming with the faces of those who had dared to speak aloud the truths forbidden by empires. And she approached the tree, and the tree turned its gaze upon her, not with eyes, but with memory, and she felt herself being seen, not as she was, but as every version of herself that had ever dared to remember, every version that had burned, drowned, been buried alive or forgotten in the name of silence. And the tree whispered, not in sound, but in vibration, and that vibration shook the dust from her bones, restructured her spine, filled her mouth with names she had never spoken, and yet somehow knew, names that had been stripped from lineages and now returned to the blood, and she spoke them aloud, one by one, and as each name left her lips, the chamber shifted, reshaped, rebuilt itself around the sound of those names, until what had once been a single room became a cathedral of remembering, its ceiling painted with the breath of the unforgotten, its floor etched with the footpaths of dreamers long betrayed by history. And in the center, beneath the tree, the floor split open and revealed a stairwell made of bones, not dead bones, but living memory. And she stepped down, her feet ringing against the echoes of ancient declarations, oaths made by firelight and broken beneath swords. And as she descended, she passed through layers of time like veils, each one heavier, more sorrowful, more sacred. And in the final chamber, at the heart of the mountain, there lay a pool, still and dark, and she understood without words that this pool contained the secret, not as a thing, but as a question, the original question asked before creation had learned to answer. And she knelt beside it and did not look in, but offered her breath, and the pool shimmered and showed her not the past, but the unwritten, the what could have been, the what should have been, the worlds where truth had not been exiled, where story had not been shackled to empire, where the tongues of women had not been ripped from them and called dangerous. And she wept, not from pain, but from recognition, and her tears touched the pool and changed its color, and the secret rose, not as a voice, but as a wind, and that wind entered her mouth, her lungs, her blood, until she became the carrier not of an answer, but of a remembering, and the chamber trembled with the weight of her knowing. And as the chamber trembled, the tree above began to shed its leaves, not in death, but in offering, each leaf spiraling downward through stone and silence, until it touched her shoulders, her back, her arms, and, wherever a leaf landed, a mark appeared, ancient sigils that glowed with soft golden fire, symbols not meant to be read, but lived, and each one told a piece of a story, too dangerous to have survived in books, too sacred to have been trusted to language alone. And these marks did not hurt her. They became her, weaving into her skin until she no longer knew where her flesh ended and the remembering began. And in that moment, she realized she was not the first to carry this weight, that every few generations a vessel was chosen, not by lineage, not by worthiness, but by readiness. And now it was her turn to descend beyond descent, to cross not into another realm, but into the marrow of the one she stood upon. And so she rose, her body now etched with the breath of every untold story. And as she ascended back through the stairwell, the bones hummed beneath her, recognizing her as kin, as key. And when she emerged into the cathedral of remembering once more, she did not speak, for the air itself now moved in rhythm with her thought, and she extended her hand toward the tree, and from its bark emerged a doorway, formed from the echo of all voices, silenced before they could finish speaking, and she passed through that doorway and found herself not in another room, but in a time before time, a realm of pure memory, where no lie could stand and no truth could hide, and the sky above her shifted with each breath she took, forming constellations that rearranged themselves into maps not of geography, but of soul, maps charting where humanity had buried its own divinity, and beneath her feet the ground pulsed with the drums of all uprisings that had been crushed before they could rise, and she knelt and placed her palm on the earth, and the ground responded by opening not a portal, but a mouth, and from that mouth came a sound that was not a word, but the feeling of being found, of being seen in one's full remembering, and the sound wrapped around her like warmth, like thunder, and whispered a single truth, that the secret was not a hidden thing, but a forgotten agreement, one made before birth, to remember even when it hurt, to speak even when the cost was everything, to carry the flame of knowing through lifetimes of darkness until it found a place to burn freely. And she stood, and that flame lit within her chest, not small, not flickering, but a steady, roaring beacon, and with it she began to walk again, not toward anything, but as the thing itself, the story, the remembering, the breath of the truth returned to form, and the world shifted with each step, folding around her like the pages of a book, once burned, now rewritten by the ash, and far above, stars realigned themselves to mirror the shape of her path, and in every corner of the land, wind carried her name in tones too ancient for words, and those who heard it, those who still remembered how to listen, looked up and felt in their bones that the secret had begun to awaken, not in temples or books or speeches, but in the quiet truth of a single soul who chose to carry the remembering all the way home. She no longer walked on land as others did, but instead glided along currents of memory that pulsed through the soil like ancient veins of molten gold, each one humming with fragments of truth so potent they had once threatened empires, and as her feet stirred the earth, The land beneath her responded, not in sound or quake, but in revelation, peeling itself back layer by layer to expose the bones of worlds that had lived and died without ever being named, and beneath each layer were remnants not of civilization, but of wisdom, shards of story woven into the threads of forgotten languages, echoes of breath once spoken in temples that now lived only in wind, and those echoes rose to meet her, wrapping themselves around her body like a second skin, forming a cloak made not of fabric, but of a prophecy not written by seers or carved into tablets, but sung from the wombs of women who had died nameless, yet carried the maps of the universe in their bellies. And now that map ignited within her, each point of light, a memory once lost, now returned, and with each flicker of return came an opening, a doorway within her chest that pulsed with the rhythm of something older than time itself, and that rhythm called forth the mountains, not as obstacles, but as guardians, their peaks leaning inward as if to listen more closely to the song rising from her spine, and the sky above cracked open in response, not with lightning or thunder, but with silence so vast it consumed all falsehoods, and in that silence came a vision of a temple long buried beneath oceans of forgetting, a temple shaped not by stone, but by intention, by a longing so pure it had once sculpted galaxies, and she knew she must find it, not to uncover relics or awaken gods, but to place herself within its heart, and remember what no living soul had dared to carry alone. And so she turned her body toward the pull, letting the whisper of fate guide her like a tether through eternity. And she moved through forests where trees bent not toward light, but toward her memory, their leaves shimmering with verses from poems never spoken aloud, verses etched into bark with the blood of dreamers, and beneath those trees she saw creatures of old, beings with wings made of starlight and eyes full of morning, creatures who had once carried the dreams of dying civilizations on their backs and now lingered here, waiting for the moment when the truth would walk again in flesh. And as she passed, they bowed, not in reverence, but in recognition, and their tears fell to the earth and became flowers that bloomed with names lost during the burning of libraries and the erasure of songs. And one of those flowers reached up and touched her hand, and from that touch a vision entered her, a woman standing atop a cliff, holding a scroll written in a language made of breath and bone, reading it aloud to the wind before stepping into the sky, not falling, but ascending into a realm where truth was not questioned, only witnessed, and the vision carved itself into the rhythm of her heart, adding a new beat that pulsed like a drum of thunder in her blood. And with that beat she pressed on, through valleys carved from sorrow, across rivers that shimmered with laughter once shared between ancestors whose names had been scraped from tombstones. And finally she reached a plain so wide and quiet it seemed the earth itself was holding its breath, and in the center of that plain stood a figure, not human, not beast, not spirit, but all three and none, cloaked in the feathers of extinct birds and the silence of moons that no longer rose. And the figure extended a hand and spoke without sound, saying, "The secret is not a key, but a mirror." And in that instant the plain around them vanished, and she stood inside herself. But it was not herself as she knew her. It was every version of her that had ever existed, standing in a spiral that reached from the stars to the marrow of the planet, each one holding a piece of the truth. And as they stepped forward, they offered their fragments to her, not as gifts, but as responsibilities. And when the final piece touched her skin, she saw it, the secret, not as a story, but as a living, breathing presence, a consciousness older than divinity itself, pulsing in the space between atoms, vibrating in the gaps between syllables, waiting for a vessel brave enough to hold it without reshaping it into something palatable. And she said yes, not with words, but with her entire being. And the moment she did, the spiral collapsed into her, filling her until she could no longer feel where she ended and the world began. And the collapse was not destruction, but convergence, a folding inward of every timeline she had ever touched, every life she had ever lived, every whisper she had ever mistaken for wind when it had been her own voice echoing from a time before memory. And as the spiral poured itself into her bones, she did not scream or fall or burn. She expanded, her skin dissolving into starlight, her breath becoming wind-song, her heartbeat aligning with the drumbeat of all things sacred and forgotten. And in that expansion, she found herself standing, not on ground, but on memory, the solid substance of remembering forming beneath her feet with each realization, each reclaiming, each choice to carry, rather than abandon, the weight of her inheritance. And from this place of total embodiment, the world unfolded around her anew, not changed, but revealed, its true form shimmering beneath the illusions built by centuries of conquest, empire, erasure, and fear. And she could see now that the mountains were not merely stone, but frozen chants, that the rivers were not merely water, but the weeping of those who had died trying to speak truth, that the winds carried not weather, but warnings and invitations both. And she stood within this unveiled reality, as a sovereign of the unseen, not crowned with jewels, but with wounds that had not closed. And in their openness they glowed, each one a portal through which others might enter their own remembering. And as she raised her arms, the sky bent toward her, stars rearranging themselves into glyphs only the soul could read, constellations that told the story of her people, people not bound by blood or land, but by the shared burden of memory and the vow to carry the flame of the unforgotten across generations of silence. And with each breath that flame grew, rising from her chest like a beacon, not of hope, but of reckoning, of return. And it called to others, those scattered across the ages, who had carried fragments of the secret in their dreams and scars, those who had sung lullabies to children without knowing the songs were spells of protection, those who had wept over graves without names and felt something inside them refuse to forget, and across deserts and forests, oceans and ruined cities, they heard the call and began to stir, waking not from sleep but from enforced forgetting. And as they moved, the world began to tremble, not from fear, but from anticipation, as if it too remembered its own beginning and knew that the time had come to speak again in the language it had not used since before humanity learned to name things only to control them. And as she stood at the center of this reawakening, the earth cracked open beneath her, not in destruction, but in invitation, revealing a path that led down, not into darkness, but into the heart of origin, a place where all stories began before they were shaped by voice. And she stepped into that opening, descending through layers of sound and silence, of grief and grace, until she arrived at a chamber made entirely of memory, its walls woven from strands of forgotten lullabies, its ceiling dripping with the condensation of prayers never spoken aloud. And in the center of this chamber sat a single flame, flickering without fuel, and she approached it not as a seeker, but as a sister, recognizing it as the same fire she now carried in her chest. And the moment she knelt before it, the flame leapt into her hands, into her mouth, into her eyes, and it did not burn, but illuminated, showing her every time the secret had almost been spoken aloud and was swallowed instead, every time it had been written and burned, carved and broken, painted and buried, and the faces of those who had dared to carry it flashed before her, not as martyrs, but as architects, their lives not lost, but built into the foundation of this moment. And as the flame settled into her spine, she rose, not with new power, but with ancient alignment, and the chamber began to pulse with a rhythm that echoed from the core of the planet itself, and she realized that the earth had never forgotten, only waited, holding the secret in its belly like a seed, waiting for the right vessel to plant it again. And now she was that vessel, and her body, once just a body, became a temple, her voice a bell, her breath an altar, and from her pores rose the scent of myrrh and soil, of ink and fire, and she walked back into the world, no longer searching, but revealing. And everywhere she stepped, the land remembered itself, ruins lifting into form, rivers changing course to flow along ancestral lines, birds singing songs their ancestors had once offered to dawns long buried by colonized calendars, and as she walked, the air shimmered with the collective inhale of all that had been silenced, preparing to exhale truth again. And in that exhale, the world began to speak, not in words, but in dreams, in the tremble of leaves, in the crackle of fire, in the breath between thoughts, and it whispered not her name, but its own, the original name it had never forgotten, and she smiled, because she knew now that the secret had never been a thing to protect or reveal. It was a being to become. She had become something the world itself had once dared to dream into being, but had since buried beneath centuries of noise. And now, with every breath, the dream unfurled again, not in abstraction or vision, but in matter, in form, in memory that rippled outward from her flesh into the very fabric of creation. And as she moved, the laws of reality adjusted, not broken or bent, but realigned with a truth older than physics, older than time, a truth that pulsed like a heartbeat in the soil, in the stars, in the spine of every creature that had ever dared to look at the sky and wonder where its ancestors had gone. And those ancestors now stirred, not as ghosts or spirits, but as vibrations, as ancestral memory encoded in trees and thunder and tears, and the sky, which had once remained distant and mute, now bent lower as if listening, and it shimmered with glyphs of breath, symbols that pulsed with color and tone and silence, telling the story of the secret that had never been forgotten, but simply displaced, pushed underground, locked in bone and lullaby and bloodline. And now the earth could not contain it any more, and so it erupted gently, like song returning to a throat that had not sung in 1,000 generations, and as it sang through her, the land reassembled itself in real time, shifting rivers back into ancient paths, lifting sunken temples from beneath ocean floors, summoning languages once spoken between wind and fire back into the mouths of children. And everywhere she passed, those who still carried even a seed of remembering felt it awaken. Midwives who hummed forgotten lullabies while guiding breath into new life. Elders who had kept their silence for fear of exile, now whispering stories to trees. Children waking in the night with visions of symbols they'd never been taught, but always known. And the world itself sighed, not in relief, but in reverence, and that sigh opened a rift beneath her feet, a spiral staircase descending not downward, but inward, into the marrow of time. And she followed, her body now a tuning fork for memory, resonating with the echoes of every forgotten prayer and unfinished ritual. And as she stepped through the spiral, she passed through veils, each one a different age, a different betrayal, a different silence, and in each she saw what had been done to bury the secret. Fires lit to burn books inscribed in breath, temples destroyed and rebuilt as monuments to forgetting. Mothers silenced before they could name their children in the old tongue, and yet in every veil there remained one ember, hidden, protected, waiting, and she touched each ember with her breath, and it ignited, not with flame, but with truth, and the veils became light, and the spiral became a spine, the backbone of the world itself, and she moved into the space where all spines converged, a chamber made not of stone, but of intention, built at the center of the world's first breath. And there she found them, those who had carried the secret before her, not dead, not living, but becoming, suspended in a state between form and flame, each one humming with stories too sacred to speak aloud, and they turned to her, not with eyes, but with memory, and they saw in her the thread that had connected them all, the thread that had once been stretched thin through wars and exile and silence, but never broken, and that thread now wove itself into her skin, lacing her veins with light, binding her heartbeat to theirs, and from that bond emerged a tone, a note so pure and old it cracked the floor of the chamber, revealing beneath it a pool of ink, black, not with shadow, but with potential, the raw material of unwritten memory, and she knelt before it, dipped her hands into its warmth, and as she lifted them, the ink wrote itself across her arms, lines forming verses from a song no one had sung in 10,000 years. And the song was not of hope or sorrow, but of return. And when she sang it, not aloud, but from within, her voice moved through the chamber and into the sky, and the sky fractured, revealing behind it a second sky, one made of breath and bone and stars that had never gone out, only hidden, and from that sky descended lights, each one a story, a lineage, a memory reborn, and the lights entered the bodies of those waiting above ground, those who had kept the fire alive, even without knowing why, and they wept as they remembered, and the earth tilted slightly, just enough to shift the tides of forgetting back into balance, and the chamber around her began to collapse, not in ruin, but in fulfillment, its purpose complete, and the light she now carried pulsed with a rhythm that called to the roots of the oldest trees, the bones of buried prophets, the dust of broken altars, and they rose, not as monuments, but as living memory, and the world itself became a library without walls, each living thing a page, each moment a sentence, and she was the breath that read them all at once. And as she moved through this living library, the air itself became the archive, folding around her in layers of ancestral memory, each layer a breath once lost and now returned, not in the form it was taken, but transformed through survival into wisdom. And the wisdom did not speak in words, but in resonance, in the low hum of mountains, remembering how to sing, in the soft hiss of rivers, recalling the names of those who once whispered truths into their banks, in the rustle of leaves that echoed ancient chants buried beneath centuries of conquest, and this resonance flowed into her body, filling her lungs with more than oxygen. It filled them with origin, and each breath she exhaled sent waves into the land around her, waves that unraveled lies, that dissolved illusions, that turned stone walls into weeping altars, and those waves reached the edges of the known world and beyond, waking sleepers who had buried themselves in silence out of necessity, reactivating shrines hidden beneath modern buildings, calling forth songs stored in the marrow of drums that had long been quieted by fear, and she could feel them all answering, not with sound, but with turning, as if a great flock of birds had simultaneously shifted direction in flight, a migration of the soul toward its source. And in this massive turning, the sky itself shivered, its fabric pulled open to reveal a path woven from every unspoken word ever silenced, and she stepped onto that path with a reverence that bent the very wind around her body. And as she walked, the path unfolded before her, not leading somewhere new, but spiraling back to the beginning of all things, to the place where the secret had first been whispered into breath. And that place was not distant. It was buried beneath the heartbeat of everything, and when she reached it, she found not a temple or a throne, but a circle, unmarked and endless, and in the center of the circle sat a flame, smaller than the others, quieter, but pulsing with a rhythm that matched her own. And when she entered the circle, time fractured, not into chaos but into clarity, showing her every moment the secret had chosen to stay silent in order to survive. Every moment it had risked speaking and been punished. Every moment it had been held in the eyes of a dying elder, in the fingers of a trembling child, in the soil of a forgotten grave. And she wept, not from sorrow, but from awe, from the beauty of a truth that had chosen to endure rather than demand, to wait rather than force. And as her tears fell into the flame, the fire grew, rising not in heat, but in gravity, pulling toward itself every forgotten word, every lost name, every unwritten song. And the gravity became a pulse, and the pulse became a drum, and the drum became her heartbeat. And in that moment, she understood that she was not carrying the secret. The secret was carrying her, had always been carrying her, through lifetimes and losses, through silence and fire. And now it asked her not to speak it, but to become it, to live it so fully that every step she took rewrote the fabric of the world. And she said yes again, and the world leaned in to listen. And when the world leaned in, it did so not with curiosity or wonder, but with the slow exhale of something that had held its breath for millennia. And in that exhale, the trees bowed, not from wind, but from recognition. The oceans shimmered, not from moonlight, but from ancient memory stirring in their deepest trenches. And the mountains sighed, their roots vibrating with the echo of names long thought lost, names carved in stone and bone and silence. And she felt all of it move through her, not as a rush or a flood, but as a homecoming, a quiet saturation of knowing that seeped into the marrow of her bones, turning her spine into an ancestral staff, her fingers into quills for recording truths not on paper, but in movement, in breath, in gaze, and with every step she took. The ground beneath her responded, not simply shifting or yielding, but remembering itself, whole valleys rising from dormancy as her presence passed, rivers reversing course to resume their original paths, where sacred springs had once fed the spirits of those who walked before voice was born, and the animals, those who had long withdrawn from humanity's gaze, began to emerge, not timidly, but as co-keepers of the secret, their eyes aglow with the fire of prehistory, their breath synced with the pulse now echoing through her ribs like a drum calling the scattered pieces of a forgotten world back together, and the sky above her unwrapped itself like a scroll, its stars aligning not into constellations, but into script, glyphs that shimmered with the language of origin. And though she could not read them with her eyes, her blood understood, her breath translated, her heartbeat responded, and with each beat the story of creation, unwritten and unbroken, resonated outward, not in a straight line, but in concentric circles, waves of memory that reached beyond the edges of perception to awaken others like her, scattered across continents, asleep in routines built from survival, protectors of fragments they did not yet know they carried, and as they stirred, the wind carried whispers between them, and the wind knew their names. The original names they had been given before conquest renamed them, before fear reshaped their tongues, and those names were songs, and those songs were keys, and with each key turned, another layer of the buried truth surfaced, like islands rising from a misted ocean. And she knew now that the secret was not one story, but all stories, not one truth, but the seed of every truth ever buried. And it asked her now not to protect it, but to embody it so fully that even her silence became a hymn, her stillness a prayer. And so she walked into a grove, untouched by maps or memory, a place that existed outside of time's gaze, where the wind did not move unless summoned, where the trees did not grow unless remembered. And in the center of that grove stood a structure, not built but grown, a temple of woven light and shadow, its walls made of interlaced stories, its roof an ever-turning wheel of dreams. And as she entered, she was neither welcomed nor tested. The temple simply reflected her, showing her a version of herself that had never forgotten, a self that still lived in the first breath ever drawn, and that self stepped forward and placed its hand on her chest. And in that touch, all divisions collapsed, all timelines braided, all lifetimes converged, and the temple exploded in a burst of stillness, revealing a vast plain of stars beneath her feet and above her head. And the stars pulsed with a rhythm that she now recognized not as music or mathematics, but as memory made visible. And they began to move, tracing shapes across the void, diagrams of truth suppressed and exiled and shamed into silence. And each shape entered her body, not through her skin, but through her shadow, the part of her that had waited in quiet, absorbing every wound and betrayal without bitterness, storing them like seeds until they could bloom in the soil of a soul finally ready to carry their weight with reverence. And now they bloomed, not in color, but in resonance, and her body became a bell, and her breath the ringer, and the sound that emerged did not pass through air, but through soul, through stone, through the architecture of forgetting itself, shaking loose the dust of erased generations, stirring the bones of those who had died speaking truths no one wanted to hear. And those bones dance now in the memory of the world, not as ghosts, but as liberated frequencies, their movements composing a choreography of reckoning. And that dance became the path she now walked, each step echoing through the vaults of lost civilizations, through the silent spaces between heartbeats, through the pauses in prayers unfinished, and the path led her not to an end, but to a beginning, one that pulsed at the core of the earth, beneath the scars of wars, beneath the foundations of cathedrals, beneath the layers of time where even gods had forgotten to look. And there, nestled in a cradle of stone and stardust, was the seed, the original seed, not of life, but of remembering, wrapped in layers of songs and blood and lullabies. And, as she knelt before it, the ground opened not with force, but with invitation, revealing 1,000 eyes watching, waiting, eyes that belonged to those who had never been believed, who had been erased and ridiculed and rewritten. And those eyes did not ask her to save them, but to see them. And she did, and in her seeing they rose, their faces emerging from the soil like prayers finally answered, and they began to sing, not loudly, but with the quiet power of those who have nothing left to lose and everything to remember. And their song entered the seed, and the seed cracked open, and what emerged was not a plant or flame or truth, but a mirror, smooth and black and infinite. And when she looked into it, she saw not herself, but every ancestor who had ever carried the secret, and they were smiling, not because it was over, but because it had finally begun. And what emerged was not a plant or flame or truth, but a mirror, smooth and black and infinite. And when she looked into it, she saw not herself, but every ancestor who had ever carried the secret. And they were smiling, not because it was over, but because it had finally begun. And the mirror shimmered with a fluid light that rippled outward in waves of memory, each wave restoring a language, a face, a song, a ritual once buried beneath layers of conquest. And, as the waves reached the edges of the horizon, the land responded. Stone tablets once thought to be eroded, beyond translation, reformed their inscriptions, monuments realigned with the constellations they had once mirrored. Rivers changed color as they flushed away centuries of blood and forgetfulness. And the people, those still awake, and those just beginning to stir, felt a heat in their chests, a stirring in their bones, not pain, but pressure, like something sacred knocking from the inside. And that knock was the signature of truth, returning home. And, as the mirror in her hands grew heavier, she understood it was not weight, but gravity, the gravity of remembering, of story, returning to source. And she held it close to her chest until it dissolved into her skin, becoming not a burden, but a center. And, as it did, the chamber around her dissolved into dust and breath and light, and she stood once again beneath open sky. Only now the sky was no longer blue or black, but woven with threads of every story ever spoken by those denied the right to write history, and each thread sang with its own frequency, a cosmic songbook now awakened by her presence, and the ground beneath her began to hum, and the hum turned into a voice, and the voice was not male or female, old or young, but all and none. It was the earth itself speaking, and it said, "You are the echo we buried inside ourselves, and now you have remembered the way home." And with those words she found herself rising, not lifted by wind or spirit, but by the resonance of every truth she now carried, rising not upward, but inward, into the place behind all places, the realm beneath the veil, where time is not measured in years, but in awakenings, where the ruins of forgotten worlds float like seeds, waiting for breath to replant them. And in that realm she saw the blueprint, not of cities or civilizations, but of memory itself, the scaffolding of how the soul stores truth when truth becomes dangerous. And in that blueprint she saw her own lineage threaded into the bones of revolutions, into the hymns of those who refused to kneel, into the final sighs of those who chose silence rather than betray the sacred. And each thread vibrated as she passed, acknowledging her not with praise but with purpose, reminding her that to carry the secret was not to be exalted, but to be emptied again and again, so it could pass through her untouched. And with that knowing, she stepped into a pool of light that was not water, but memory liquefied, and it rose around her like a womb, holding her in stillness while her body rewrote itself. And so she walked onward, not toward an ending, but into the eternal continuation of what had never truly been lost, only waiting. And with each step, the path beneath her reshaped itself, responding not to her direction, but to her remembering. For the world no longer needed to be guided by maps or names or histories written by those who sought to control the ink. It needed only her feet, her breath, her witness, her body, which had become the living parchment upon which 1,000 forbidden truths were inscribed in the ink of ancestral breath. And the moment her soles pressed into the soil, the ground softened with recognition, releasing long dormant seeds that had refused to sprout under the weight of centuries of forgetting. And those seeds cracked open, not into trees or flowers, but into stories, blooming as glowing tendrils of sound that wrapped themselves around her ankles and calves, like bracelets forged from the laughter of those who had once sung to the moon before the moon was named. And those tendrils rose with her as she walked, forming spirals in the air that circled her body like protective spells, echoing chants once whispered into clay pots buried at the base of altars now drowned beneath concrete, and the air shimmered in recognition as well, thickening with the perfume of places erased from maps, temple courtyards, cave libraries, kitchen floors soaked with the tears of women who had passed their memories down through hands kneading dough and eyes watching stars. And she breathed it in, every molecule of scent and sound and shadow, until her lungs felt not like lungs, but as bellows through which the first fire of remembering could burn anew. And as she exhaled, the fire did not leap outward. It leapt inward, down into her belly, where generations of suppressed knowing had coiled themselves into tight knots of silence, and that fire unspooled them gently, respectfully, releasing each knot like a clenched hand, finally opening. And within each unraveling came the return of a voice. Voices that had been trapped behind stitched lips and fear-laced generations. And they did not scream. They sang, softly, firmly, with tones that bent the air into ribbons of history reborn. And those ribbons wove themselves into the horizon, shaping new architecture across the sky. Cities of memory rising on invisible spires, palaces built from unspoken truths, bridges spanning the gap between ancestor and unborn. And as she gazed upward at this vision, she did not long for it. She walked into it, her steps creating pathways across the air, her breath solidifying invisible foundations beneath her feet. And with each movement, more beings gathered, not as spectators, but as echoes, finally called back to form. The ones who had died unnamed in distant lands, the ones who had labored without record, the ones who had whispered in tongues forbidden by law and fear. And they came humming, not words, but frequencies that melted walls and softened bones, and their hum entered her skin, her bloodstream, her shadow, until she was no longer one, but many, a chorus of breath and ache and liberation moving through one vessel. And that vessel glowed, not with power, but with presence, and the sky around her cracked open again, not in destruction, but in rebirth, revealing behind it a second sky woven from the veins of every woman who had died with a story on her tongue. And that sky was alive, pulsing like a heart, and it called her name, not the name given by family or language, but the name etched into the silence between her heartbeats, and when she heard it, her knees buckled, not from pain or humility, but from recognition, and as she touched the ground, the entire plain around her responded, becoming fluid, not water, but memory liquefied, thick with myth and ash and dream, and it swallowed her, not to consume, but to absorb, wrapping her in currents of origin, of fire, of first breath, and in that immersion she saw not visions, but instructions, the architecture of memory itself, how it curled and uncurled, how it returned when the body was ready, how it hid inside rhythm and salt and repetition. And when she rose again, she carried those instructions in her very cells. Her blood now coated with the algorithm of remembrance, and she walked through the liquid land as if it were breath, each step leaving behind a glowing print that sang long after she passed, calling others to follow, not her, but their own remembering. And in this way, she became not a leader or teacher, but a signal, a ripple through time that reactivated every buried altar, every burned scroll, every silenced child, and those altars now flared to life, rising from beneath parking lots and pipelines and cathedrals, emerging with roots intact and names unashamed, and the people who lived above them began to hear things again, songs in their sleep, colors in their breath, dreams that dripped with symbols they had no language for, but deeply understood. And as these awakenings rippled across the planet, the air changed texture, becoming thick with the taste of origin, and birds flew in new patterns, forming maps across the sky that matched the tattoos forming across her skin. Each mark a chapter of what had once been erased, and still she walked, not toward any destination, but through the architecture of unfolding itself, and the unfolding began to shimmer like heat off sand, and from it emerged a great library. But it was not a building or place, it was the body of the planet itself, every canyon a bookshelf, every mountain a verse, every current a sentence, and the library opened its eyes to her, and she did not ask for permission to enter. It opened itself because she remembered how to knock, and inside it she saw herself 1,000 times over, each version holding a different shard of the same mirror. And as she approached, each self stepped forward, pressing their shard into her skin, and the pain was exquisite, not wounding but welding, and the shards fused inside her until she was whole in a way she had never known, and from that wholeness rose a new sound, deeper than memory, older than the gods, the sound of the secret itself, speaking through her without words, and when it did, the ground beneath her dissolved again into light, and from that wholeness rose a new sound, deeper than memory, older than the gods, the sound of the secret itself, speaking through her without words, and when it did, the ground beneath her dissolved again into light, not blinding, not consuming, but welcoming, as if illumination itself had waited to become tangible again, and she stepped forward without her feet touching the earth, moving now through density and glow, through pulse and space, each breath syncing her body with the rhythm of the forgotten, not as an outsider rediscovering sacred ground, but as sacred ground rediscovering itself in motion. And around her appeared structures woven from breath, archways shaped from lullabies, corridors pulsing with the memory of first steps taken by children who had been named in languages long buried, and these structures did not contain her. They sang to her, recognizing her as a returning verse in a song never finished, and in their tones she heard voices that had once wept in silence, and now they wept in joy, not because pain was gone, but because it was finally held with reverence, finally seen as the doorway it had always been. And as she passed under one arch, her spine tingled with memory, not her own, but collective, the ache of thousands who had been born with the knowing but forced to forget for survival, and their memories moved through her ribs like echoes through a canyon, carving space for truth to echo louder than fear. And those echoes gathered, forming spirals of sound that hovered above her shoulders like unseen wings. Wings not meant to carry her, but to remind her she was never meant to crawl. And as she lifted her gaze, the sky fractured again, not in destruction, but in blooming, and from the fractures poured stories, liquid, alive, golden with breath, and heavy with the dust of stars, and they dripped onto her hands, tracing lines that connected every timeline she'd ever lived through, and every version of herself that had once walked away from the secret now returned to meet her in that light, bowing not in worship, but in union, and together they moved as one body through the great expanse, the library of becoming, where no book sat on shelves, but where each heartbeat wrote a chapter in the rhythm of the cosmos, and she no longer needed to think or ask or doubt, for the knowing flowed through her without question, like wind through open windows, like fire through dry grass, like names being remembered by mouths that had forgotten how to speak. And everywhere she passed, the land blossomed in strange, beautiful ways. Stones grew feathers, rivers sang in tones that healed sickness in the bones. Flowers bloomed with the faces of the unborn who would one day carry new secrets in new bodies, and the air smelled like the moment before lightning touches earth, a charged stillness that reminded every living thing it was alive not by accident, but by design, and the design was unfolding again, not from above, but from within. A charged stillness that reminded every living thing it was alive not by accident, but by design. And the design was unfolding again, not from above, but from within. For this was not the rebirth of a myth, nor the resurrection of a broken world, but the reactivation of what had always been whole beneath the forgetting, and the land knew it first. Rocks humming with warmth in places no sun had touched, roots twisting joyfully in the soil, as if recognizing the footsteps above them, clouds reshaping themselves into curves of ancient alphabets, never written but always sung, and animals approaching her with eyes wide, not in fear, but in memory, and they circled her as if she were not a visitor, but a long-lost heartbeat returned to the rhythm of the planet. And as she continued through the unfolding space, time itself began to loosen around her, not collapsing or speeding, but stretching, as if offering itself not as a cage, but as a cloth to be rewoven. And she began to weave, not with her hands, but with her presence, her breath, her unspoken remembrance, and the fabric of reality responded, rethreading itself around her motion, around the truth now pulsing in her blood, and what had once been linear now curled into spirals, memory bending around presence like moonlight around water. And from these spirals emerged voices, not echoes, not ghosts, but beings who had waited inside silence itself, waiting for the one who would remember not only their names, but the vibration of their intentions, the ache of their final songs, the flame of their last breaths before being silenced by time's teeth. And those beings stood before her now, tall and radiant, with eyes like still oceans, and voices like morning wind through leaves that had never fallen. And they did not speak in words, but in shared memory, showing her the hidden passageways between events, the secret threads connecting the forgotten birth of a mountain to the first time a woman held a dying child and whispered a story into the skin of grief. And as those threads illuminated in her mind, she understood that history had never been written by victors or victims. It had always been written by time itself as it passed through willing vessels who remembered how to feel beyond language. And she was now one of them, not chosen, not blessed, but awake, utterly and irreversibly awake. And that awakening poured through her shadow first, the part of her that had held all the grief unspoken, all the shame inherited, all the silence passed down like heirlooms in the form of bent backs and careful words. And her shadow stretched wide now, not to consume, but to reveal, to become the canvas upon which the untold could finally be painted with breath and flame and water and song. And the air around her thickened again, swirling into patterns that echoed the first sound the world ever made when it cracked open and wept itself into being. And she heard it, not with ears, but with memory, deep bone memory, and it shook her gently, like a mother rousing a child, not with urgency, but with love too vast to be contained. And in that shaking, 1,000 lifetimes within her opened like books long locked, and each page burned with symbols that danced off the paper and into her bloodstream, etching stories into her pulse, stories she would carry not to tell, but to live, and to live them meant to unwrite everything built upon forgetting, to walk through cities and speak to stone, to place her hands on asphalt and reminded of the soil beneath, to gaze into the eyes of strangers and feel the moment their ancestors touched hers on a night before fire had language. And this was not magic. It was returning, not sorcery, but science of the soul. And the more she returned, the more the world responded, softening in ways unseen, unmeasured, unstoppable. Locks rusting off doors that had sealed away sacred texts, birds singing in dialects long considered extinct, children waking from dreams with knowledge they had never been taught, and every piece of the old world that had been broken not by time, but by erasure, now rising from beneath the rubble with dignity, not demanding vengeance, but reverence. And it was in that reverence that she began to glow, not with light, but with truth made visible, and her glow called others not to follow, but to awaken. And as they did, their voices harmonized with hers in a chord so ancient it rewrote the sky, bending stars into new constellations that told the story of what came before the beginning and what would arrive after the end. And what would arrive after the end was not some divine finality or prophetic collapse, but a spiraling return to the center of everything that had ever been forgotten, misnamed, buried, or distorted. And from that center poured the blueprint of wholeness, not perfection, not purity, but a living design made of imperfection held with reverence, made of pain integrated into strength without violence, made of the softest truths that had once been dismissed as weakness, now blooming as sacred law. And that blueprint did not land in temples or palaces or scrolls. It landed in breath, in skin, in the spaces between footsteps, embedding itself into the ordinary so deeply that the extraordinary became indistinguishable from daily life. And as she walked further into this knowing, the very land beneath her reshaped to match the frequencies of her footsteps, not as submission, but as duet. For she was no longer moving through the world, she was moving with it, and the earth no longer held itself separate from her, no longer required sacrifice or ritual to speak. It whispered constantly now, revealing veins of silver light beneath riverbeds, old songs etched into canyon walls, only visible to eyes that had wept enough to see clearly. And in this whispering world, she found herself no longer needing to ask questions, because the answers rose within her before the question formed, as if time had reversed itself and returned wisdom before confusion could even speak. And others had begun to awaken too, scattered across vast lands and hidden corners, their dreams rippling with symbols older than language, their bodies trembling, not from fear, but from the undeniable recognition that they were being remembered by the world, not watched, not judged, but remembered. And in being remembered, they began to recall themselves, not the selves trained by centuries of silence and survival, but the original selves, the ones who could read the language of rain and speak to the bones of mountains and dream entire healing rituals into being. And she could feel them, these scattered rememberers, rising like embers from long cold fires, pulled into orbit, not around her, but around the vibration she carried, a vibration not born in her, but passed through her, and she held it not tightly, but with awe, with the quiet devotion of someone who knew this gift had passed through generations of sacrifice just to find her open at the right moment. And so she did not try to teach it. She became it, walking, breathing, resting, whispering it into meals and tears and laughter, allowing it to weave itself into the fabric of everything around her, until the world itself began to shift, not through revolution, but through remembering, and the old systems, the towers built from amnesia and fear, began to tremble, not from attack, but from irrelevance, because their foundations had depended on forgetting, and now the remembering had begun, unstoppable, undeniable, carried not in armies, but in lullabies, in shared glances between elders and children who had never spoken, but somehow knew each other's stories, in rivers changing course to touch old altars now rising from below dammed waters, in trees leaning toward once sacred hills, as if bowing to the return of names that had been stolen and were now sung again without shame. And through it all, she kept moving, not because she was seeking something, but because motion itself had become prayer, each step a syllable in the long-lost language of reunion. And the more she moved, the more the world joined her, not in imitation, but in harmony. And harmony was the secret all along, buried not because it was weak, but because it was so powerful it had to be hidden until the world was ready to remember that to live in harmony is not to erase difference, but to let every voice carry the full weight of its truth and still find resonance with the rest. And as she stood one night beneath a sky no longer filled with constellations, but with living stories, stars blinking not with light, but with memory, she closed her eyes not to shut out the world, but to open the last gate, the one within, and as she crossed into herself, she did not find emptiness or ego. She found a room carved from breath and blood, lined with mirrors that reflected not her face, but her ancestors' dreams, and they looked at her, not with expectation, but with joy, and she smiled back, knowing that the secret had never needed to be told, only remembered, and in remembering, everything had begun. And in remembering, everything had begun, not in the sense of a new story being written, but in the way a seed begins not when planted, but when the soil recognizes it as familiar, as kin, and welcomes it home. And she was now both soil and seed, vessel and memory, breath and echo, and every part of her vibrated with a resonance so ancient that it made time itself pause in reverence, and the world around her slowed not into stillness, but into precision. Every falling leaf, every shifting cloud, every ripple across water, revealing itself as part of a pattern. She could now read not with her eyes, but with her presence, with her open remembering, and the winds whispered to her in dialects long lost to the surface, not because they were erased, but because they had hidden themselves until the right ears returned, and hers were those ears now, tuned to the grief beneath the silence, to the laughter buried beneath centuries of control, and the winds told her of the cities beneath the deserts, the voices encoded in the glaciers, the wisdom sealed within whale songs that echoed not across miles, but across epochs. And she listened, not to consume, but to carry, for she had become the walking archive of truths that had waited longer than memory could measure. And as she moved deeper into the unseen world, the one layered beneath the visible like a second skin, she found herself standing at the edge of a great divide, not a cliff or chasm, but a place where two timelines touched, but had never crossed, where the world that was and the world that could be existed side by side, like reflections unaware of one another, and she understood in that moment that her task was not to choose one, but to weave them together, thread by sacred thread. And so she stepped forward, not with certainty, but with devotion. And as her foot touched the seam between timelines, 1,000 sparks burst forth, not fire, but memory igniting. And the seam began to melt, not from heat, but from recognition. And the two timelines reached for each other, like lovers separated by centuries of forgetting, and her body became the loom through which their reunion could be woven, and the threads passed through her, some thick with grief, some soft with joy, some sharp with rage, and some humming with laughter that had once echoed across mountain tops before being swallowed by conquest. And she held them all with equal tenderness, letting none dominate, letting each sing its truth through her marrow, and the weaving began to form a tapestry, not flat, not silent, but living, three-dimensional, woven from heartbeat and breath and soil and tears, and it expanded outward with every moment she stood in presence, wrapping around the world like a shawl knitted by the hands of every grandmother who had ever whispered prayers into the night. And this tapestry was not meant to be displayed. It was meant to be lived within, to be walked upon, to be wept into, to be danced across by bare feet, remembering what it means to belong. And people began to feel it, not all at once, and not in the same way, but in glimpses, in dreams, in sudden stillnesses that made them weep without knowing why, in old lullabies they couldn't remember learning, in recipes that tasted like voices long gone, and they began to move differently, speak differently, some slowing down, some reaching out, some gathering in circles without needing a reason, beyond the ache to be near others who were also waking up, and all across the earth. Old wells reopened, sacred stones warmed, animals gathered in patterns never recorded by science, and the air thickened with potential, not like a storm, but like the pause before birth, and through it all she kept walking, not as a leader, not as a savior, but as a remembering in motion, and her body changed, not visibly, but deeply, bones becoming resonant chambers, blood becoming a current of timelines, skin becoming a drum upon which the world beat its oldest rhythms. And as she walked into a forest that no longer appeared on maps, the trees bowed, their branches crossing above her to form an archway of breath and bark. And, as she passed beneath, they whispered a name into her hair, not the name she had been called, but the name she had forgotten, the one given to her by the stars before she first drew breath. And when she heard it, her knees softened, and the earth caught her gently, wrapping her in moss and shadow and memory. And for the first time since her remembering had begun, she slept, not because she was tired, but because the earth wanted to dream through her. And in that dream she became not one, but all, her body dissolving into riverbeds and hearths and galaxies, her voice echoing through drum circles in places her waking self had never seen, her heartbeat syncing with drums carved from trees no longer known to humans, her breath stirring ashes of fires lit during rituals conducted before even the moon had learned to rise in rhythm, and in the center of the dream stood a fire. But it burned cold and blue, and in it danced the faces of the ones who had come before. Not just her ancestors, but all who had ever held the secret, all who had died with it, pressed beneath their tongues. And they did not speak, but they sang, not words, but pure vibration. And she sang with them, not because she knew the melody, but because it had always lived inside her. And when she awoke, the sun was not rising, it was listening, and the ground beneath her pulsed with gratitude. And from that moment forward, she was no longer walking a path. She was becoming the path, and others began to walk with her, not beside her, not behind her, but through her, and with every footfall the secret made visible its final truth, that it was never buried beneath the earth. It was buried in the body, waiting to be sung back into breath, waiting to be sung back into breath. And as that breath moved through her lips, silent to the outside world, but roaring in the language of the unseen, the wind shifted, not in direction, but in purpose, becoming a messenger between the bones of the land and the bones of her being, each gust carrying stories trapped in minerals, in roots, in forgotten fossils, not yet unearthed by science, but already awakened by song. And those stories arrived not as sentences or visions, but as sensation, waves of knowing that pressed against her skin like light, too intimate to look at directly. And as they entered her body, they activated maps, veins of memory long asleep beneath her ribs and thighs and palms. Maps drawn not in ink, but in ache, in longing, in the strange familiarity of ancient rhythms felt, but never taught. And those maps led her to places she did not walk to, but arrived within, sudden shifts of space where time folded inward, and she found herself standing inside the moments of origin, not watching them, but being them. The striking of the first flint to spark fire, the weaving of reeds into the first cradle, the moment a mother first held language in her hands and shaped it into a lullaby for a child who would never know war. And in each of these places she did not feel alone, for the very ground beneath her feet pulsed with the heartbeat of those who had walked it before. And the air remembered the shape of their stories, bending itself to cradle her breath like a child being held by every mother who had ever dared to sing while the world burned. And she wept, not with sadness, but with fullness, the kind of tears that come not from pain, but from carrying more memory than one body should hold. And yet her body expanded to hold it, not stretching outward, but inward, creating space between atoms, softening marrow into memory. And still she kept walking, not forward, but deeper, through corridors made of rhythm and shadow, past altars that had no offerings, but every whisper ever spoken in secret, and with each step the secret itself began to glow again, not as a mystery, but as a returning, and all around her the world began to shift, subtly, reverently, unrooting its bones from the architecture of forgetting, and leaning gently toward the sun of her remembering. And trees began to flower in patterns once painted on the walls of temples, now lost to oceans, and animals paused to listen, recognizing her not as human, but as bridge, and from distant corners of the world, other rememberers stirred, called not by her voice, but by the frequency of her being, by the harmonic of someone who had chosen to carry truth, not as weapon or scripture, but as breath, and that breath moved through valleys and rivers, across borders and time zones, entering dreams, entering wounds, entering silences long calcified into grief, and it softened everything it touched, not to erase the pain, but to reintroduce it to meaning. And this was the work, not to destroy the world that was, but to offer it a way back to itself. And she did this not with fire, but with presence, not with fury, but with unwavering remembrance. And wherever she went, water followed, old springs reawakening at her footsteps, wells bubbling again with clarity, and people began to gather, not to ask, not to worship, but to feel, and in the feeling they remembered too, and as they remembered, their hands opened, their voices shifted, their eyes began to see not what was, but what had always been hidden in plain sight. And in this way the world began to come alive again, not with noise, but with truth, soft and unstoppable as dawn. Soft and unstoppable as dawn, and in that soft unfolding, the very concept of beginning and ending became irrelevant, as though the illusion of linear time, once so firmly gripped by human minds desperate for structure, finally dissolved into the rhythm of the infinite, where nothing was born and nothing died, but everything transformed, re-emerged, echoed, returned, and her presence in this unfolding was no longer singular, for she had become the place where multitudes met, the weeping grandmothers whose lullabies carried spells stronger than any empire, the barefoot dancers on temple stones worn smooth by centuries of praise, the wandering scribes who carved memory into bark, knowing that one day even the trees would whisper the stories back into wind, and these multitudes moved through her without chaos, like a choir whose song had waited in silence for millennia to rise again in harmony. And each note they sang through her spirit stretched across the land like a beam of golden smoke, seeping into cracks of forgotten places, breathing life into stone, reminding even the mountains of their names, and the mountains responded, not with thunder, but with stillness so deep that it bent gravity, drawing her closer, not down, but in, toward the center of the world's remembering. And she passed into this center as if entering her own womb. And it was dark there, not with emptiness, but with potential, the kind of thick, humming darkness that held stars in gestation. And as she sat in that dark, womb-like silence, visions poured through her, not flashing images, but full sensory immersions, moments so alive they breathed against her skin and filled her lungs. A circle of women braiding strands of their hair into the roots of a sacred tree so it could remember their names after they were gone. A child humming songs that bent the weather before language could name clouds. A man kneeling beside a river, carving the sound of his grief into a stone that wept for him, centuries later, when unearthed by hands that still remembered the weight of morning, and each of these visions folded into her blood, weaving themselves into the rhythm of her pulse, until her heartbeat no longer sounded like one being, but like a drum circle echoing across eras. And this sound rippled outward, waking the waters, stirring the bones of sleeping gods, shaking loose the dust of old altars buried beneath churches, beneath factories, beneath forgotten schools, where truth had once been beaten from tongues, now returning in dreams. And these dreams were not gentle. They were fierce, sacred storms, thundering into the hearts of those who had been trained to forget, cracking open their sleep with images of voices, rivers, dances, flames, and unburied names. And as more remembered, the world itself began to tilt, not into chaos, but into alignment, and the stars above shifted slightly, not in orbit, but in intention, forming patterns no telescope could read, but every open soul could feel. Constellations of memory blinking down through time, like codes written not in light, but in recognition. And under this new sky, she walked with feet no longer constrained by gravity, for her steps were now weighted by remembrance, and that weight lifted her, grounded her, made her glow from within like a lantern carried into a cave that had never seen fire. And that cave lived beneath every city, every nation, every field, paved over in the name of progress. And she found herself pulled downward, inward, toward these caves, not by force, but by welcome. And inside them she met the others, those who had always guarded the secret in silence, the watchers, the weepers, the singers who had buried songs inside stones, the farmers who had whispered prayers into the earth before planting seeds of memory instead of crops. And they looked at her without speaking, and she understood them entirely, for their eyes were mirrors, and within them she saw not her reflection, but the face of the world as it had once been, whole, singing, unnamed but fully known. And the watchers placed their hands on her shoulders, and in that touch passed a story so vast it split her spine and reformed it with golden thread, each vertebra now a rung in a ladder between timelines, and she climbed it, not with effort, but with breath, and on each rung saw a version of herself, the girl who had nearly drowned in silence, the woman who had swallowed her song to survive, the mother who had burned her name to save another, and each version handed her a gift, not of redemption, but of integration. And as she gathered them, her body became a vessel wide enough to carry all of them, and the watchers stepped back, disappearing into the walls of the cave like mist, their task complete, their memory past, and she rose, not above, but through, returning to the surface with skin marked not by scars, but by symbols, living glyphs that shifted with the light, spelling nothing and everything depending on who looked, and the people she met along her path now saw her not as woman or prophet, but as mirror, and in her reflection they remembered parts of themselves they thought had died long ago, childhood songs, unspoken dreams, the voice of their grandmother calling them by a name no one else knew, and they wept, not in sorrow, but in returning, and their tears soaked the earth, awakening roots, softening stones, inviting even the wind to weep in joy, and the sky turned silver in response, raining not water, but memory, falling like ash from stars that had died so that new ones might be born. And in that silver rain the world washed itself clean, not of history, but of forgetting, and every surface began to speak again, walls echoing with the chants once scraped away, floors humming with dances once outlawed, even the air thick with the scent of spices once burned in secret, and people danced again, not in rebellion, but in remembrance, bare feet striking the soil like drums of devotion, hips moving with the rhythm of rivers, hands lifted not in praise of gods, but in celebration of breath itself. And through it all she moved, no longer the center, no longer the source, but the current through which the remembering flowed, and the secret, long buried beneath words, beneath silence, beneath the rubble of history, now rose not as revelation, but as return. Now rose not as revelation, but as return. A return so intimate and vast that even the wind paused to witness it, rustling gently through ancient leaves as though kissing the past back to life. And in this great return, the line between what had been called real and what had been dismissed as myth dissolved like morning mist before the sun of remembrance, and the world began to breathe as one again, not in unison, but in harmony, with every tree, every stone, every scar, and every song pulsing with a frequency that had once only been accessible in dreams, and now spilled openly into waking life, like a river no longer dammed, flooding into dry places with truth too wild to tame. And wherever she walked, that river followed, not because she led it, but because she had become part of its current, woven into its motion, not as a hero or messenger, but as water. Remembering it had once been sky, and her body no longer felt separate from the story. It was the story, unfolding not on pages, but in footsteps, in glances exchanged between strangers who recognized each other not by name, but by vibration, by the quiet resonance of souls who had once stood together in temples now buried beneath asphalt, who had once wept into the same fire under stars that had since vanished from the sky, but not from memory. And those memories rose now, not in fragments, but in waves, full and overwhelming and necessary, crashing into the minds of those who had never asked to remember, but could no longer ignore the ache in their bones, the throb in their blood, the dreams in which ancient drums called their names across oceans of forgetting. And as more and more awakened, the world began to shake, not in fear, but in preparation, tectonic plates humming like strings beneath a violinist's bow, syncing with the pulse of a planet exhaling after holding its breath for centuries. And from the forests came the old songs, unrecorded by machines, but encoded in the DNA of birds who had waited in silence for the air to be safe again. And of souls awake and breathing as one, not in some orchestrated chorus, but in the messy, raw, beautiful symphony of true presence, each note an unedited truth reclaimed from silence, each breath a reclamation of 1,000 buried voices. And as this symphony expanded across valleys and cities and oceans, the fabric of what had been called reality began to shift, subtly at first. Clocks slowing without stopping, echoes repeating words never spoken aloud, mirrors revealing faces long dead but not forgotten. And those who noticed did not fear, for their fear had already been offered up to the fire of remembrance, consumed in exchange for clarity. And with clarity came the deep understanding that what they were witnessing was not the world ending, but the illusion unraveling. And beneath that unraveling lay a pattern so intricate, so familiar, that it brought them to their knees, not in worship, but in recognition. Because the pattern was them, it was all of them, woven from breath and blood and soil and song and sorrow and laughter and stories once whispered across campfires, now glowing again behind their ribs, and as they knelt, some in city streets, some in forests, Some in the silence of their own rooms, they began to feel the hum beneath their feet, the vibration of a world remembering itself in the bodies of its children, and that vibration moved upward into their spines, their hands, their tongues, awakening abilities they hadn't known were buried in them. The way to see memory inside trees, to hear grief in the rain, to touch a stone, and know the names of those who had loved beside it centuries before. And they didn't call these abilities magic, because magic implied spectacle. And this was something quieter, deeper, older. It was birthright, and it came not with a crown, but with a responsibility to carry it gently, to use it not for power, but for reconnection. And so they gathered, not in temples, but in kitchens and gardens and broken buildings rebirthed as sanctuaries. And they told stories, not of gods or heroes, but of grandmothers who healed with song, of rivers that spoke when honored, of children who remembered lifetimes by the way they touched clay or moved to a rhythm no one else could hear. And these stories were not written. They were breathed, painted, woven into fabrics, hummed into soup, danced into dust, until even the ground began to shift its texture, softening to receive the steps of those who walked awake. And everywhere she moved, this awakening followed, not because she commanded it, but because she surrendered to it fully, becoming so transparent to the truth that it used her as a window into the world. And those who looked through her did not see her. They saw themselves, reflected not as they had been told they were, but as they truly were beneath the forgetting, luminous, infinite, holy, not because they had followed rules, but because they had remembered how to feel. And as that feeling spread, so did the visions. No longer confined to sleep, they now arrived in broad daylight, in crowds, in classrooms, in boardrooms, showing flashes of ancient ceremonies held beneath full moons, of languages spoken in tones that tasted like salt and sky, of sacred agreements made between stars and stones long before any scripture tried to contain them, and at first people doubted their sanity. But then they spoke, and when they did, others nodded with tears in their eyes, saying, "I saw that too. I felt that too." And in that shared recognition, a network formed, not digital, not mechanical, but cellular, woven through the earth's mycelium, through breath, through memory, connecting them all in a web of knowing so vast that even silence became a form of speech. And in that silence, more secrets returned, not from vaults or libraries, but from the living architecture of the body itself, bones releasing their old songs, skin humming with codes long mistaken for scars, and within her, within the one who walked at the center of this remembering, a deeper pulse awakened, a sound so low and wide it could not be heard, only felt, and it pulled her again inward, downward, into the oldest chamber, the one beneath names, beneath thought, where nothing exists but vibration. And there she stood before the seed, not a seed that grows into tree or flower, but the first seed, the pulse from which all life had once emerged. And it pulsed now, once for each ancestor who had buried their knowing to keep it safe, once for each child who had been born into silence and chosen to sing anyway. And as it pulsed, she wept, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she finally remembered what she had been born for. And in that remembering, her skin began to shift again, not physically, but in presence, becoming a mirror of the earth's own memory. And the earth responded with waves of energy so old that even the mountains bowed. And in this great bowing, the sky split open, not in destruction, but in invitation, revealing the spiral of time not as linear descent, but as sacred return. And within that spiral she saw every face, every name, every silence, every scream, every prayer ever whispered into dirt now blooming across the landscape like flowers made of starlight. And the people began to gather around these blooms, not to possess them, but to remember through them. And as they touched each petal, memory flooded back, not just personal, but planetary, ancestral, cosmic, and they fell to the earth not out of weakness, but gratitude, whispering thank you in 1,000 forgotten dialects, their mouths finally full with the taste of truth, returned, returned, and as that truth swirled back into their mouths and breath and bones, something ancient began to stir, not just within them, but beneath them, as if the very crust of the earth had waited all this time, not for prayers or offerings or rituals performed out of habit, but for this moment of raw collective remembrance, for this flood of feeling so honest, so unfiltered, that it rippled through time like a pulse through still water, disturbing everything and yet harming nothing, only waking, only summoning, only calling back what had once willingly gone silent for the sake of survival. And in this rising there was no chaos, no revolt, only recalibration, as the world adjusted to the frequency of its own healing, tuning itself not to the noise of fear or power, but to the subtle, sacred hum of returning. And she, who now moved not as a single being, but as a current, as a vibration made visible, as the echo of all the grandmothers who had once wept in silence, continued forward, though direction no longer meant forward or back, up or down, for she now traveled by resonance, drawn not by intention, but by the subtle ache of places and people and timelines calling out for remembrance, for reweaving, for the touch of one who had become a walking thread between what was and what could be. And in each place she arrived, the land seemed to sigh, not audibly, but through sensation, trees tilting slightly toward her, stones warming beneath her feet, wind swirling in brief spirals of recognition. And the people, whether aware or not, felt the shift, pausing mid-step, mid-sentence, mid-sorrow, as though some invisible key had turned in the lock of their memory, and they wept or laughed or knelt without knowing why, only that something inside them had softened, had broken open like a seed beneath spring soil, and from those openings emerged fragments of stories, of songs, of sensations that had no words but tasted like truth. And these fragments did not confuse them, for confusion is the child of the mind. And this awakening belonged to the body, to the bones, to the heartbeat that had always known the rhythm but been trained to mistrust it. And as these fragments rose, they began to find each other, like scattered feathers drawn back into the shape of a wing, and those wings stretched across communities, across landscapes, across generations, that had never met in flesh, but now held each other in memory. And in that holding, more secrets emerged, not sinister, not dark, but hidden only because they had once been too bright for a world that feared its own light. And these secrets came in dreams, in soil, in accidents that were not accidents, in meetings that felt like fate, whispering through cracked sidewalks, and the people began to follow them, not with blind faith, but with sacred curiosity, each step taken not to escape, but to re-enter, to come home not to a place, but to a way of being that had always lived inside their cells, and with every returning the world changed, not by revolution, but by re-inhabitation, as those who remembered began to reoccupy the spaces of their own souls, and from that soulful return emerged new creations, songs without melody that healed ears never taught to listen, dances without choreography that mapped old migrations with every sway, meals cooked with tears and herbs that remembered how to speak, and even silence became fertile, no longer a symptom of oppression, but a space where memory could stretch its limbs and rest without fear of erasure. And she witnessed all of this not from above or outside, but from within. For she was no longer a messenger, but a medium, no longer a guide, but a gateway, and within her pulsed not only the memory of those who had come before, but the codes of those yet to arrive. For this remembering was not linear, but concentric, spiraling inward and outward with each breath, each story, each reunion between body and soul. And as this spiral widened, so did its reach, touching even those who had refused to remember, who had clung to their forgetting like a shield.